She asked for water. They looked past her like she didn't exist. By the time the flight landed, the crew realized too late who she really was. No yelling, no threats. Just one quiet report that triggered a chain they couldn't stop. And in the end, the woman they tried to ignore was the one who shut everything down. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss future stories like this one. Leona Briggs sat in seat 2A, her hands folded gently in her lap. She wore a dark blue wrap coat and a silver pin shaped like a small dove. The other first-class passengers had settled in with champagne flutes and soft conversations. Leona kept to herself, reading the folded program for her husband's ceremony. In 3 days, he would be honored in Washington, D.C. as the new regional police chief of public oversight. The city had booked her this flight as part of the official package. It was supposed to be a quiet, simple trip. She looked out the window, watching the rain streak against the glass before takeoff. The flight attendant walked by. Tall, sharp-jawed, hair tied too tight. Her name tag said, Tara. She gave a quick smile to the man sitting behind Leona, calling him Mr. Hollis and offering him sparkling wine. When she reached Leona's row, she didn't speak, just nodded once and passed by. Leona said nothing. She wasn't new to this. She had walked through enough lobbies, stores, and meeting rooms where politeness didn't mean kindness, and quiet glances meant something else entirely. As passengers settled in, Tara returned with drink service. Again, she addressed every row with warmth, by name, with casual charm. Mr. Dwyer, would you prefer the Brut or the Chardonnay? Mrs. Connolly, we also have cucumber water if you'd like that instead. When she reached Leona again, she paused, gave the smallest smile, then asked flatly, Drink? Leona's voice was soft. Just water, thank you. Tara didn't respond. She turned and walked off. No acknowledgement, no glass. The tray never came. Leona waited 5 minutes, then 10. She didn't call the button. She didn't look around for help. She simply leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment, trying not to feel what she already knew. It wasn't new, but it still stung. The man across the aisle, a white-haired man with a wristwatch thicker than his wrist, looked over and gave her a glance, then went back to his newspaper. He had seen it too, but he wasn't going to get involved. People like her were always alone in moments like these. Leona opened her purse and took out a small hand towel, dabbing the side of her eye not from tears but from a quiet fatigue that always showed up on flights like this. She sat still, said nothing. The plane began to taxi. This was supposed to be a good weekend. She didn't know yet that a single moment, just minutes away, would turn this flight into something no one on board would forget. Not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't need to. The plane lifted off the ground with a gentle pull. Leona kept her seatbelt fastened, her fingers resting lightly on the fabric. She didn't look around. The silence in her row felt heavier than the rest of the cabin. Across the aisle, the man from earlier had already been served a warm croissant with jam and a second drink. The attendant serving him was different this time, young, fresh-faced, and full of charm. He smiled wide as he poured the orange juice. Leona glanced down at her own tray table. Still empty. No water, no napkin, not even a smile. She pressed the corner of the tray gently with her thumb, not to open it, just to remind herself it was still there. She had seen this before, not always on planes. Sometimes it was in boardrooms, sometimes in boutiques. A voice too flat, a face too blank, a tone too sharp to be professional. These things weren't loud, but they were clear. She remembered once years ago standing next to her husband at a city dinner. A man had mistaken her for the caterer and asked her to refill his wine. Darren had corrected him gently, but the sting had lingered. Some slights didn't bruise the skin. They pressed on the spirit. Back in the cabin, Tara returned. This time she was holding a tray of meals. She leaned into the row behind Leona, placing a cloth-covered dish in front of a woman with a pearl necklace and bright lipstick. "Your gluten-free salmon, Mrs. Connolly," she said with a smile that stretched too far. She didn't make mistakes with names when it mattered. Then she stepped forward and looked at Leona. "No more vegetarian options left," she said plainly. "We have a cold chicken sandwich or nothing." Leona looked up. Her voice stayed calm. "I had a pre-ordered vegetarian meal. Booked 3 days ago. It's in the system." Tara shrugged. "Sometimes it doesn't update." Her words were smooth, but her tone wasn't. She placed the sandwich tray down with a quiet thud. The plastic edges hit the table hard. No apology, no explanation. She turned away. Leona stared at the sandwich. The bread was pale. The lettuce was wilted. There was a packet of mustard tucked under a cheap napkin. No silverware, no cloth tray. Nothing like what the others had received. She didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, she picked up her phone from her lap. No signal in the air, of course, but that didn't matter. She opened her secure notes app and typed 3 words. Conduct flag, 402. She saved it, locked the screen, then folded her hands again and looked straight ahead. She wasn't angry. She wasn't sad. But something in her had shifted, and Tara Mendez had no idea what she had just started. The sandwich sat untouched on the tray, looking almost out of place in the soft lighting of first class. Around Leona, glasses clinked, cutlery tapped against porcelain, and the soft hum of quiet conversation filled the air. It was as if nothing had happened, as if no one had noticed that one passenger had been handed a boxed meal, while the others dined on warm, plated dishes covered with linen napkins and polished utensils. Leona kept her posture straight. She wasn't going to bend over that tray. She wasn't going to let the smell of cheap mayonnaise or the stickiness of plastic cutlery mark her face with frustration. She knew what that would look like. Difficult. Emotional. Making a scene. She had been trained, not by books, but by years of being the only black woman in rooms full of suits and small talk, to carry her discomfort in silence. Behind her she heard laughter. A dry chuckle from the man across the aisle. "Must have skipped her order," he muttered to someone beside him, low enough not to be clear, loud enough to be felt. Leona didn't turn around. Her jaw tensed slightly, but she kept her gaze on the seat in front of her. A few rows back, a young flight attendant, different from Tara, walked past, glancing her way for just a second too long. He looked like he knew. His eyes caught the sandwich on her tray, lingered on the lack of silverware, and then quickly moved on. No words, no questions. Just the kind of silence that protects people from being involved. Leona shifted slightly in her seat and crossed one ankle over the other. Her phone rested on her thigh, the screen black now. But her mind wasn't quiet. She thought of Darren, her husband, how he had spent years building his reputation, not just as a police officer, but as a leader who had changed things from the inside. He had worked his way through every level of a system designed to keep men like him out. Now he was in charge of cleaning it up. He knew how systems worked. He knew how bias crept in without a name, how it lived in jokes, glances, and seating charts. And he had taught her something important. You don't have to be loud to be heard. You just have to be exact. She looked down at the tray again, not out of sadness, but to memorize it. The sandwich, the napkin, the chipped edge of the plastic cup. Details mattered. People forgot emotions, but they remembered proof. Tara passed by once more. This time she didn't stop. Her hand brushed against Leona's arm as she leaned across to speak to the man beside her. It wasn't an accident. The tray shook slightly from the motion, the mustard packet falling to the floor. Still no apology. Leona slowly picked up the packet and placed it back on the tray. Then she reached into her handbag and pulled out a small black notebook. It wasn't fancy, just something she used when she needed to write down what couldn't be forgotten. She opened it, wrote one line. Seat 2A. No water, no meal, no apology. Then she closed it. The man beside her shifted slightly, sneaking a glance at her notes. He looked back toward his glass of wine quickly, pretending he hadn't seen anything. But he had. That was enough. Leona folded her hands again. She wasn't ready to act yet. But the time was coming. And when it did, she wouldn't need to raise her voice. The facts would speak for themselves. Leona stared at the seat back in front of her, but her mind was far away. Years back, maybe even decades. It was strange, the way one small moment could unlock so many old ones. She could still hear the voice of her high school counselor telling her she was more suited to practical careers. Not law, not politics, not anything that made decisions. "You're very polite," he had said, as if that was a compliment. She remembered sitting outside a courtroom at 26, dressed in navy slacks and a borrowed blazer, waiting to testify for a civil rights case Darren had been working on. A clerk had asked her twice if she was there to serve coffee. That same week, she had helped write the entire brief. People saw what they expected. And if you didn't fit that picture, if your skin, your posture, your silence didn't match the story they already had in their minds, they tried to fit you back into it. Sometimes gently, sometimes like Tara. Her stomach twisted, not from hunger, but from something else. It was a familiar weight, a mix of humiliation and the exhaustion of having to decide again how much of herself to protect. Should she let this one slide? Let Tara feel like she had done her job? Or speak up and be labeled overreacting before they even reached DC? She could feel the judgment already, like a storm gathering under her skin. It's just a sandwich. She probably made a mistake. You're being sensitive. But it wasn't just a sandwich, and it wasn't a mistake. It was everything she'd seen before. The careful rudeness, the performance of politeness for others, and the cold efficiency used to erase her presence. Leona turned slowly and looked down the aisle. Tara was now crouched near row 1D, chatting lightly with a well-dressed couple. Her smile had changed. Softer, warmer, almost sweet. Leona studied the way her hand rested on the seatback, the way she laughed with just enough volume for others to hear. She knew how to turn it on, which meant she also knew how to turn it off. It wasn't forgetfulness, it was a choice. Leona took a deep breath and slowly unwrapped the paper napkin on her lap, more to keep her hands busy than anything else. Her fingers felt cold, her jaw ached from staying clenched. She hated that it got to her, but it always did. That was the trick. These moments were never loud enough to scream about, but always sharp enough to hurt. She glanced sideways and caught the eye of the young attendant who had passed her earlier, the one who had hesitated near her row. Their eyes met for a second. His lips parted like he might say something, then closed again. He nodded politely and moved on. So that's how it would go. Again. She was alone in this, but not entirely. She leaned down slowly and reached for her carry-on. Inside was a slim case with a built-in power port and secure access link to a private communications network. Not public internet, not personal email. Just one-touch encrypted contact with her husband's executive assistant, a feature installed after the last time she had been followed through an airport terminal by a stranger who just wanted to talk. Leona clicked the screen open, typed a passcode, and paused. Her thumb hovered over the contact marked, Office, Chief Briggs, Direct. Her reflection stared back at her in the screen's faint glow. Composed, calm. But something beneath the surface was shifting. She thought about Darren again, his lectures to new recruits. Never ignore the small things. Big problems always start small. She tapped the message window. Her hands didn't shake. C2A, Flight 402. Issue with senior crew. Request quiet flag protocol. She read it twice, then hit send. There was no noise, no ping, no sign of anything happening. Just a tiny confirmation on the corner of the screen. Flag received. Processing. Leona slid the device back into her bag, smoothed down her dress, and looked ahead. Across the cabin, the lights dimmed slightly as the plane cruised through a layer of cloud. She could feel the vibration of the engines through her seat. Everything looked normal. Everyone looked relaxed. But she knew what the system would now begin doing, quietly pulling logs, checking service times, reviewing behavior, running it all against standard procedure. It had started. Tara didn't know it. The passengers didn't know it. Not even the pilot had been told yet. But something was unfolding now, step by step, like a quiet machine set into motion by one small push. And it was all because a woman who had been overlooked one too many times finally decided not to let it go. The air in the cabin felt still, like the kind of silence people don't notice until something has already happened. Leona sat unmoving, her hands placed gently over the tray as if guarding the untouched sandwich. She hadn't eaten. She didn't plan to. Her stomach didn't want food. It wanted dignity. She watched the cabin crew move with ease, weaving through the rows, pouring coffee, bending politely to adjust napkins, laughing at passengers' jokes. None of that grace had touched her seat. Not once. Not even by accident. It was like there was a wall around her. A quiet, invisible line that marked her as not quite belonging. It wasn't the first time she'd felt it, but this time it pressed harder. Leona thought back to a Sunday afternoon, nearly 10 years ago. She and Darren had been at a restaurant in Baltimore after one of his speeches on policing reform. The hostess seated them in the back corner, near the kitchen doors, even though half the dining room was empty. They didn't complain. They didn't want to start anything. But halfway through the meal, Darren had leaned in and said, "You know, they sat us back here because they think we won't tip like the others." Leona had smiled, tight-lipped, and replied, "Then let's leave them something they won't forget." She'd tipped 40% and handwritten a note. We noticed. We just chose not to argue. Back then, it had felt like a small victory. But now, sitting here with a sandwich that didn't belong in this cabin, she wasn't sure small victories were enough anymore. Tara returned. Leona heard her heels click before she saw her. She was moving quickly down the aisle, holding a fresh cup of coffee on a silver tray. Her eyes avoided Leona's seat entirely, as if it didn't exist. She stopped 2 rows ahead and leaned down to hand the drink to a man in a navy suit. "Extra cream, just how you like it," she said, voice soft and sweet. The man laughed. "You remember everything." Leona didn't blink. Her eyes stayed locked on Tara's back, her jaw firm. There was no hate in her expression, just clarity. She wasn't being dramatic. She wasn't trying to make a scene. She had simply been erased, and there was nothing subtle about it. Tara turned to walk back and finally, her eyes landed on Leona again. Still no words, no apology, just a flicker of acknowledgement, a glance too fast to mean anything. Leona raised her eyebrows slightly. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make Tara pause for half a second. The attendant hesitated in front of her row, maybe waiting for Leona to say something. But she didn't. She didn't owe anyone the labor of explanation. Tara moved on. From behind, a woman's voice whispered. "She didn't even ask if you needed anything." Leona turned slightly and caught the eyes of an older woman with gray streaks in her hair, seated across the aisle. She looked embarrassed, like she hadn't meant to say it out loud. "I'm sorry," the woman said quietly. That didn't look right." Leona nodded once. "It wasn't." The woman looked down at her lap. "If you say something, I'll back you up." Leona's lips curved just slightly. It wasn't a smile, not fully, but it was enough. She turned forward again. She didn't need backup. Not anymore. Her husband had built a system of accountability for officers who abused power. She had helped design the communication protocol he used to monitor misconduct. She knew how evidence moved through official hands. She knew what triggers audits, who flags logs, how silent actions leave loud footprints. And she had already pressed send. The system was watching now. The meal records, the service times, the tone analysis software embedded in cabin audio logs. It was all in motion. Tara thought she had gotten away with a slap. Not of a hand, but of dignity. The kind that doesn't leave bruises but makes someone feel like they're made of glass. And Leona wasn't made of glass. She had been cracked before, but she never shattered. As the plane continued its smooth ride over the Midwest, a notification buzzed on Leona's watch, soft, silent, and coded. "Conduct flag received. Team review initiated." She tapped the screen once, acknowledged it, and closed her eyes. Outside the window, the clouds looked gentle and harmless. But inside the system, the sky had already started to shift, and none of them, not Tara, not the passengers sipping wine, not the pilot in the cockpit, had any idea what was already headed their way. The soft ding of the seatbelt sign turned off. A few passengers stood to stretch. Others shifted in their seats, unbothered and full from their polished plates. The scent of warm pastries still lingered in the cabin. Leona could smell the cherry crumble someone had just been served 2 rows ahead. The contrast between that and the cold sandwich sitting untouched on her tray made her jaw clench again, not from anger but from something deeper, something older. She looked at her tray once more. The sandwich had started to dry out at the edges. The lettuce had wilted completely now, curling inwards as if even it didn't want to be part of this. The little napkin folded beside it looked smaller than it had 30 minutes ago, and the water cup, only half full to begin with, now had tiny beads of condensation trickling down its side, like sweat. Leona didn't move. She just watched it all. Not because she didn't know what to do, but because she knew exactly what she was doing. She had learned long ago that the most dangerous tool wasn't anger. It was patience. People always underestimated a calm woman, especially one who didn't push back right away. They mistook quiet for defeat, stillness for submission. But what they never saw, what they couldn't imagine, was that in silence people like her were taking notes, remembering, preparing. Her thoughts wandered to her childhood, sitting with her grandmother on a creaky porch in North Carolina. "You don't have to shout to be heard, baby," her grandmother used to say. "You just gotta speak when the room is finally quiet enough to listen." The room wasn't quiet yet, but it would be. She reached into her bag again, this time pulling out a small hand mirror. Not for vanity, just something she always carried when traveling. Habit, more than anything. She glanced at her reflection. Her makeup was still neat, lipstick holding, mascara untouched. Her face was composed, but her eyes looked tired, not from the flight, from the weight of having to do this again, to sit in a space she had earned, with a ticket, with merit, with years of supporting someone who had reshaped an entire department, and still be treated like a mistake in the system. She wasn't a mistake. She was the test the system failed over and over again. Across the cabin, Tara moved with ease. She was helping a passenger with his recliner button now, smiling brightly as she kneeled beside his seat. Her laugh was light, her tone soft. She looked like someone who had mastered the art of customer service. To most people watching, she was doing her job well, but Leona knew better. It wasn't about what Tara did. It was who she chose to do it for. Selective kindness, targeted professionalism, the type of treatment that didn't break rules, but bent them just enough to draw a line between who mattered and who didn't. Leona's watch buzzed again, shorter this time. A second code had been received. This one meant the report was now actively being reviewed. Crew identifiers logged. Passenger meal confirmations cross-checked. Cabin audio being parsed for service tone discrepancies. All of it done without noise. She returned the hand mirror to her bag, then slowly sat back in her seat. She crossed her legs at the ankle, adjusted the fold of her coat, and folded her hands once again. The passenger across the aisle, Mrs. Connolly, watched her for a long second. Leona felt it, but didn't react. Let them wonder. Let them feel that something was happening and not know what it was. That was how change began. Not with shouting, but with unease, with the discomfort that comes from watching someone who should have crumbled. Stay upright. She turned her head slightly toward the window, letting the fading light play across her face. Somewhere far below, the world went on as usual. Cars moving, people shopping, someone picking up dinner on the way home. And yet, right here, in this cabin filled with white noise and warm desserts, a storm had already begun. It had no sound, but it would leave nothing untouched. The overhead lights shifted slowly from daylight to a dimmed amber glow, signaling the transition into the quieter portion of the flight. It gave the cabin a soft, almost tender hue. an illusion of peace that didn't match what Leona felt inside. She hadn't said a word in over 40 minutes. Not to a single crew member. Not to a passenger. Her silence had grown thick around her, like a second skin. But it wasn't passive. It was deliberate. In that silence, every movement around her became clearer, every whisper more obvious, every choice made by the crew more loaded. Tara passed again. Still no eye contact. Still no question if she needed anything else. Leona watched her from the corner of her eye. The way her smile lifted so effortlessly when addressing the man in 1C. How she leaned down, laughed gently and said, "You always pick the Bordeaux." I should have known. It wasn't just service. It was intimacy, performance, the act of making certain people feel seen, and by contrast making others feel invisible. It was subtle, but Leona saw it, every single time. She turned back toward the window. Her reflection stared back at her faintly now, half-shadowed, softened by the dim cabin light. She studied her own expression. Calm, composed. But there was a tiredness under her eyes she couldn't hide. Not from herself. Not after this many years of having to stay graceful, even while being dismissed. She thought about how many times she had explained things gently to avoid being called aggressive. How many times she had smiled while being spoken down to. How many times she had been the most qualified person in the room and still treated like someone who had wandered in by mistake. She had worked her entire life to never be underestimated, but it never stopped happening. And what burned even more was the fact that it didn't come from loud insults or slurs. It came from shrugs. It came from being served last. It came from someone not even bothering to learn your name. Tara hadn't said Leona's name once. She had served 5 other passengers around her, called 3 of them by name, even remembered what 2 of them drank on previous flights. But Leona, just ma'am, cold and flat, as if she didn't deserve to be remembered, as if she didn't belong here. Leona closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in through her nose slowly, deeply. Her fingers curled slightly against her knee. She wasn't angry, not in the way people think of rage. It wasn't hot. It was cold, focused, controlled. It sat at the base of her spine like something she'd learned to live with, like a warning system that never quite turned off. She opened her eyes again. Then came the moment that changed everything. Tara returned, this time quickly, as if irritated. She carried a small cup of water on a tray, the kind they handed out like an afterthought. She didn't stop at Leona's seat. She leaned across it to hand the cup to the man beside her. Mr. Ellison, she thought his name was. And as she did, her hand jerked. The tray tilted, and the edge of the cup caught Leona's shoulder. The water splashed, cold and sharp, against her collarbone. Not enough to soak her, but enough to sting. Enough to humiliate. Tara's eyes widened, but only for a split second. "Oh," she said dryly, "didn't see you there." No apology, no towel, just those 6 words. "Didn't see you there." Leona slowly turned to face her. Her hands remained folded. Her chin tilted upward, not in pride, but in clarity. "You didn't see me?" she asked, voice low even. Tara hesitated. For the first time, there was something uncertain in her expression. Her posture shifted, subtly, like she suddenly didn't feel as in control. Leona didn't wait for an answer. She turned back to her seat and calmly dabbed at her blouse with the edge of the napkin that had come with the sandwich. The sandwich she still hadn't touched. Around her, the air felt different. A passenger nearby looked up. Another leaned forward slightly, as if they had caught something in Leona's voice they hadn't expected. A firmness that made them rethink what they'd been ignoring all flight. Leona didn't speak again. She didn't need to. She reached into her bag, unlocked her tablet, and opened a folder labeled simply, OCP Oversight. It was the department her husband had founded after becoming regional police chief. The Oversight and Conduct Program, designed to investigate misconduct, quietly, efficiently, and without warning. She opened a secured subfolder, typed a quick message. Incident escalation. Flight 402. Cabin crew Tara Mendez, priority review requested. Media discretion advised. She hit send. She didn't look for a reaction. She didn't scan for validation. She simply leaned back and let the quiet settle over her again. Somewhere behind her, a few passengers had gone silent. They'd seen the splash. They'd heard the tone. And maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to realize this wasn't a woman who would walk off this plane and forget it ever happened. Leona didn't want an apology. She wanted the system to feel what it had taught her to carry for years, and now it was going to. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight entered cruising altitude over Ohio airspace. A low announcement crackled through the intercom. Altitude level reached, expected weather clear, estimated arrival still 2 hours away. The captain's voice was calm, routine, the kind of voice meant to keep things ordinary. But nothing about the atmosphere in Seat 2A felt ordinary anymore. Leona Briggs sat still, her blouse now slightly damp where the cold water had splashed earlier. A faint ring of moisture marked the edge of her collar. The chill had faded, but the feeling hadn't. It wasn't the water that unsettled her. It was the way it had been handled. Like she didn't matter. Like her discomfort was a small thing that didn't deserve attention. And it had been handled exactly how so many things in her life had been handled. Minimized, dismissed, overlooked. She could feel her pulse in her wrist now, steady but firm. Her body had long since learned to hold emotion tightly, never letting it leak where it could be used against her. The silence she kept wasn't weakness. It was discipline. The kind you only learn after years of being spoken over, ignored, or politely excluded from rooms where decisions were made. Across the aisle, Mrs. Connolly glanced at her again, her expression tight with discomfort. She had seen the splash. She had heard Tara's flat, didn't see you there. Leona could see in the woman's eyes the quiet struggle, the part of her that wanted to say something, and the other part that didn't want to get involved. That was how this worked. Polite people said nothing. Uninvolved people looked away. And the system counted on both. Leona returned her gaze to the tablet in her lap. The screen still glowed, soft and blue, displaying a short confirmation. OCP flag received. Preliminary activity logged. Full review pending. It had begun. Quietly, efficiently, exactly as it was designed. Her husband, Chief Darren Briggs, had worked for nearly a decade to build this framework. It wasn't just for officers. It wasn't just for police stations. It had been expanded across city departments, into airports, medical centers, and yes, even airline partnerships. The idea was simple. If a person representing an institution behaved with quiet discrimination, the system needed a quiet way to respond, with power, not noise. Leona had once asked him if he thought it would work. He had told her, only if people like you are brave enough to use it. So now she was. She placed the tablet back into her bag slowly, gently. Her fingers lingered on the zipper, then closed it. She sat back, not with comfort, but with resolve. Tara reappeared 2 rows ahead. Her voice was back to its carefully curated customer tone. Would anyone care for dessert? We have chocolate mousse or creme brulee. Leona tilted her head slightly, watching her. The performance never cracked. Not once. If you didn't know better, you'd think Tara was flawless, gracious, efficient, charming. But Leona did know better. She had felt the temperature change the moment she boarded. She had seen the quick glances, the small delays, the lack of eye contact, the way Tara had subtly recoiled when handing her a tray, the way her tone flattened only with her, the way other passengers got warmth while she got instructions. She could list every moment, in order, with timestamps, because that was the kind of woman she had become over the years. Not loud, not emotional, but exact. She let her eyes linger on Tara just long enough that the attendant glanced her way. For the first time since the flight began, Tara's expression shifted, just slightly. A flicker of something Leona couldn't quite define. Not fear, not guilt, but unease. That was enough. The woman who had dismissed her was starting to realize she might have made a mistake. Tara turned quickly and disappeared into the galley. Leona sat with that for a moment. Her breathing was steady, her hands relaxed. But inside her something powerful had settled. A knowing. A sense that she had crossed a line she wasn't coming back from. Not because she was seeking revenge. Not because she needed validation, but because if she didn't respond, nothing would ever change. And that meant this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the next woman who sat in seat 2A. The next black passenger who ordered a meal in advance and was told it wasn't available. The next time a crew member smiled at everyone except one. She had stayed quiet in many moments like this over the years. Too many. She had told herself not to cause trouble. She had smiled through insult. She had shrugged off dismissal. But not today. Today she had asked the system a question it could no longer ignore. Outside the window, the sky had turned darker. The last of the sunlight flickered across the tops of the clouds. It looked peaceful, almost soft. But Leona knew better than to mistake quiet skies for still air. Beneath that silence, pressure was building. Systems were shifting. Logs were opening. Reviews were being pulled. And she was at the center of it. Not because she wanted to be, but because she refused to disappear. The flight moved steadily through the night sky, cruising over the last stretch of the Midwest. The cabin was now mostly quiet. Passengers settled into movies, half-lit screens flickering over their drowsy faces. A few had reclined their seats, soft blankets pulled up to their waists, a warm drink resting on tray tables. But Leona Briggs remained upright, not out of discomfort, not even out of anger. She was simply waiting. Her posture was relaxed, but her senses were sharp. Every footstep, every hushed murmur from the galley, every click of a drink cart felt louder to her now. She had entered the kind of awareness that years of self-control had trained into her body, the ability to sit still but remain fully alert. She rubbed her thumbs slowly against the smooth curve of her wedding band. The gold had dulled slightly over the years, but it was still firm, still weighty. A gift from Darren after their 10th anniversary. He'd said, "It's not new, but neither are we. And yet we're still strong, still here, still here." That's how Leona felt in this moment. Not victorious, not defeated, just present, unwilling to vanish like the system so often wanted people like her to do. The curtain separating first class from the galley shifted slightly. A face appeared. Not Tara. It was the young male flight attendant. Nervous eyes, dark hair, hesitant steps. He held a tray with a folded linen napkin and what looked like a fresh dessert. He glanced at her seat, then back at the galley curtain. His body language screamed uncertainty. Leona watched him approach. Slowly, cautiously. He stopped beside her and lowered his voice. "Ms. Briggs?" he said, barely above a whisper. Her name. The first time anyone on this flight had said it. She nodded once, steady and silent. I wanted to apologize," he began, voice awkward but genuine. "I saw what happened earlier. I didn't know what to say, but I should have said something. I'm sorry." He set the dessert in front of her, creme brulee, perfectly smooth with a side of fresh raspberries and a silver spoon. No plastic, no paper. "I thought maybe," he hesitated, his face flushing. "You deserved better than what you got." Leona looked at the plate, then back at him. "You're not the one who served me the sandwich," she said quietly. "I know," he replied, "but I served the silence." That stopped her. It was honest, clumsy, but honest, and it cut through the surface. She let out a long breath, not quite a sigh. "Then thank you for finally seeing me." He gave a tight nod and turned to leave, the tray now empty in his hands. Leona looked down at the dessert. She didn't touch it right away. It wasn't about the food. It never had been. But something in her eased, just slightly. Someone had seen. Someone had cared enough to break the pattern. But the moment didn't stay gentle for long. 10 minutes later, a different kind of shift happened. A quiet knock on the cockpit door. The curtain pulled back. A third crew member, female, older, unfamiliar, entered the first-class cabin. She wore a dark blazer instead of a standard crew uniform, and a small gold pin that read Supervisor. She moved directly to Leona's row and paused. "Ms. Briggs," she said, her voice low, official. "My name is Carmen Leving. I'm the in-flight operations supervisor. I've been briefed on a concern that was logged during this flight." Leona nodded. "You've been briefed already?" "Yes, ma'am. Our operations team received a live flag from a third-party protocol. The system initiated an alert for crew behavior and passenger treatment inconsistencies. I'm here to begin the initial record." The words were clinical, efficient, no drama. But behind them was weight. Leona could feel the energy shift across the cabin. A man in 1D sat up straighter. The couple across from her paused their movie. Mrs. Connolly across the aisle didn't even pretend not to listen. Something was happening, and this time no one could ignore it. Supervisor Leving pulled out a small tablet and began speaking in a quieter tone. "This isn't a formal investigation, yet. I'm here to log your experience and notify you that senior review has already been activated through internal compliance." Leona didn't speak right away. For a moment, she felt the pull of old instincts, the urge to say, "It's fine," to minimize, to let it pass, to protect her own image before someone labeled her a problem passenger. But not this time. "I was served last. I was served the wrong meal. I was dismissed, ignored, and then physically brushed by a crew member who spilled water on me and didn't apologize," she said, slowly, clearly. "And not once was I addressed by name. Until now." Supervisor Leving gave a single nod, her face unreadable. "Understood," she said. "And the crew member involved?" "Tara Mendez," Leona answered, without hesitation. The supervisor tapped her screen. "Please know, your report has been marked under immediate level review, with executive notice. Upon landing, this will be escalated to our compliance director and third-party oversight liaison." It was happening, not in public, not on social media, but in the system itself, and this time, the system couldn't pretend it hadn't seen her. The supervisor stood. "Thank you, Ms. Briggs. We'll notify you once the action chain has begun. For now, please let me know if you need anything else." Leona looked up, her eyes steady. "I need them to understand this wasn't about a sandwich." Leving paused. "Yes, ma'am, I believe they will." Then she turned and walked back through the curtain. The moment she disappeared, the cabin seemed to exhale. People stirred, eyes darted. A quiet tension sat over the rows like static. But Leona, she didn't flinch. She leaned back, folded her hands, and waited. Because this time she wasn't walking off this plane invisible. This time the flight crew wouldn't be the only ones writing a report. The cabin didn't return to normal. Not really. People tried. A few restarted their movies. Some reclined their seats again, forcing smiles and soft sighs as if nothing had shifted. But something had. The air felt tighter, quieter. Conversations dropped in volume even among those pretending not to notice. The scent of dessert still lingered, but the sweetness had turned stale. Leona sat motionless. She hadn't touched the crème brûlée, not because she was bitter. She simply didn't want it. It had arrived too late, not in time to comfort, only in time to cover. And she wasn't hungry for comfort anymore. She was hungry for accountability. She watched the flight attendants move now, studied their faces. Daniel, the younger man who had brought her the dessert, looked nervous. He walked slower, avoided eye contact with Tara. His hands trembled slightly as he cleared the tray from another passenger's seat. He wasn't guilty, not directly, but he had known. And now he was trying to unknow what he had seen. Mrs. Connolly gave Leona another glance across the aisle. She looked like she wanted to speak, but hadn't found the courage yet. Leona understood that feeling. The deep discomfort of knowing something is wrong but wondering if saying something will cost you more than it's worth. That was what the system counted on. People measuring their discomfort against their inconvenience and choosing silence. Leona shifted slightly in her seat and pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. Her blouse was dry now, but she could still feel the cold where the water had touched her. It was like her skin hadn't forgotten. She thought of Darren. of the long nights he had spent in meetings trying to change things from the inside. City officials who smiled in public but hesitated behind closed doors. Leaders who nodded at his ideas and then buried them in committees. And of the times he had come home exhausted, loosened his tie and said, "They think progress is a press release." They both knew better. Real change wasn't loud, it wasn't glamorous. It didn't trend. It was quiet, heavy, slow, and it started with one person refusing to shrink. A soft vibration on her wrist broke her thoughts. She glanced down at her smartwatch. A new notification glowed across the small screen. Compliance escalation approved. In-flight review initiated. Crew behavior monitoring active. Internal audit reference ID 402-MZ-Tier 2. Her heart didn't race. Instead, something deeper settled into her bones. Validation, not for revenge, not to humiliate, just to be seen, in full, without shrinking to make others feel comfortable. Across the aisle, Mrs. Connolly finally leaned over. Her voice was soft, barely above the drone of the engine. "I saw all of it," she said. "If they ask, I'll tell them." Leona nodded slowly. "Thank you." Another pause. The woman's fingers fidgeted with her wedding ring. I think we all saw it," she added, voice lower now. "We just didn't know what to do." Leona met her eyes, holding them there for a beat. Not with anger, not with blame. Just a truth too heavy to ignore. "You do now." The woman looked away, ashamed, not humiliated, just reflective, like someone who had been looking at a blurry picture and suddenly saw it come into focus. That was enough. Leona wasn't looking for allies. She wasn't trying to build a case in the court of public opinion. The review had already begun. The wheels were already turning. And this time, she wasn't leaving it to someone else to interpret what happened. She had documented everything. The untouched meal, the time she had been skipped, the exact moment the water was spilled, the line Tara had said, "Didn't see you there." That line, more than anything, was what she had sent in the report, not because it was cruel, but because it was revealing. She could still hear it echoing in her mind. "Didn't see you there." A phrase so casual, so common, and yet so sharp. That was how discrimination had evolved. No longer loud slurs or harsh insults, just absence, erasure, the quiet choice to look through someone instead of at them. Leona reached into her bag and pulled out her notebook again. She opened to a fresh page. Her pen hovered for a moment. Then she wrote, "The system didn't need to scream to fail me. It only needed to stay silent." She paused, then added, "But I didn't stay silent." As she closed the notebook, she heard footsteps approaching, not hurried, not rushed, but firm. Tara. She appeared at the end of the row again, her face unreadable, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. There was no tray this time, no smile. "Ms. Briggs," she began, her voice lower now, practiced, but thin around the edges. "I wanted to say I apologize if anything I did was uncomfortable." Leona tilted her head slightly. "Uncomfortable?" A long pause stretched between them. Tara's mouth moved slightly, but no words came. "I mean," she tried again, "if I caused any distress." Leona stared at her, calm as ever. "Are you apologizing?" she asked. "Or avoiding responsibility?" Tara swallowed. Her face stiffened. "I just wanted to be professional." "You've already done that," Leona said evenly. "Professionally selective. Professionally cold. Professionally dismissive. So now be honest." Tara looked down, but the silence around them had grown thick. Too many ears were listening now. Too many eyes had shifted from their books and screens. "I didn't mean to make you feel overlooked," Tara finally whispered. "That's the problem," Leona replied. "You didn't need to mean it, you just needed to not care." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult. But the weight of her words was louder than any outburst could have been. Tara gave a small nod and stepped back. Then she walked away. Leona didn't watch her go. She simply reached for her seatbelt and fastened it again, even though the captain hadn't announced the descent yet. Something inside her knew they were nearing the ground, not just in distance but in consequence, because what had happened in the air wouldn't be left behind when the wheels touched down. This time, it would land with them. The captain's voice returned, this time softer, more formal, laced with that practiced calm all pilots are trained to use. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our initial descent into Washington, D.C. in approximately 20 minutes. Please remain seated as we prepare for landing. Thank you again for flying with us this evening. There was a rustle in the cabin as people slowly straightened in their seats, folding away blankets, unplugging devices, stretching arms that had grown stiff in sleep. But for Leona Briggs, nothing shifted. She had been upright the entire time. She hadn't closed her eyes once. Her mind was too active. Not spinning, not anxious, but quietly organizing, sorting through everything that had unfolded over the last few hours. Tara's long absence, the untouched sandwich, the dismissive glance, the water, the apology, if one could even call it that. And now, the descent. The descent always brought a strange energy to flights, a shared sense of return, of reality approaching. Passengers suddenly more aware of one another, more alert to the space they shared. But this time the atmosphere felt heavier. Wordless tension floated between rows. A few passengers glanced at Leona now, no longer hiding it. And she let them. She had nothing to shrink from. In fact, she felt taller, not proud, not triumphant, just anchored. Because this wasn't just about what happened to her. It was about what people like Tara had been allowed to do, unchecked, for years. About how easy it was to dismiss someone quietly, as long as you smiled while doing it. About how many passengers had sat in these same seats, feeling the same sting of being ignored, and told themselves they were imagining it. Leona wasn't imagining it. She had receipts. She reached into her bag again and opened the secure tablet one last time. A new alert blinked at the top of the screen. Incident ID 402-MZ- Tier 2 has been upgraded. Final status: Tier 1 escalation. CEO notification pending. Legal review requested upon arrival. She stared at it for a long moment. Tier 1, the highest possible level of in-flight conduct review. That meant full audio review of cabin recordings, crew behavior history checks, and a waiting response team on the ground. It meant the airline's legal division had already been contacted. It meant Stratus Air's CEO would be informed of the report before midnight. Leona didn't smile. She didn't pump her fist or feel any burst of satisfaction. Instead, her chest tightened slightly, not from nerves but from the weight of what it took to get here. The emotional labor of staying calm, the strategic restraint, the decision to speak in the right tone, at the right time, so no one could twist her into the angry woman trope they expected. She had to carry herself like evidence. Even her silence had to be deliberate. The landing gear dropped. A low, mechanical hum vibrated through the floor beneath her. She tightened her seatbelt, then folded her hands once again. Tara hadn't reappeared. Not since their last exchange. Not even to complete her final walkthrough. The young attendant, Daniel, had taken over the front cabin service. He moved slowly now, like someone walking across a frozen lake trying not to crack it. He stopped beside Leona's seat briefly, cleared the untouched dessert tray and whispered, "They're meeting the plane when we land." She didn't ask who. She already knew. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once. No words, then kept walking. Outside her window, the lights of Washington twinkled into view. Roads lit like veins, buildings glowing like tiny embers across the city grid. It was a place she had flown into dozens of times. But tonight, the city felt different, more exposed. Like it too was about to face something it had long looked away from. The plane tilted into final descent. Passengers braced instinctively, holding onto seat arms, straightening their backs. Leona remained still. As the runway approached beneath them, she closed her eyes, not to rest, but to remember. She remembered the time she'd walked into a high-level community board meeting and was asked whose assistant she was. She remembered standing beside Darren in uniform and having a man shake his hand and completely ignore hers. She remembered being told by a colleague at a city fundraiser, "You speak so well. It's refreshing." And she remembered how many times she'd been told, with a smile, that she probably misunderstood. But she hadn't misunderstood. She had endured, she had recorded, and now she had responded. The tires screeched softly as the plane met the ground, the force pushing her gently forward in her seat. A collective breath exhaled through the cabin. Some clapped faintly, more from habit than celebration. Leona opened her eyes. She watched the runway lights blur by in streaks until the aircraft slowed to a calm roll. Then came the pause, wheels clicking beneath the cabin, a soft tone overhead, the mechanical whir of engines powering down. A voice came through the intercom, not the captain's. "This is your lead crew member speaking. Please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened. Ground staff will assist us shortly." It was neutral, carefully neutral, but behind it she could hear it. A shift, an alertness. They knew. Leona looked forward. Through the narrow gap between the curtain and the exit row, she could see the entry door. Two silhouettes stood just beyond it. One wore a suit, the other wore a visible airport security badge. They weren't here to greet passengers. They were here to investigate. And this time, it wasn't because someone made a scene. It wasn't because someone shouted or cursed or went viral. It was because someone in seat 2A had simply refused to disappear. She unclipped her seatbelt, adjusted her coat, and waited. Not for justice, just for the system to finally look her in the eye. The plane came to a full stop at gate 47, but no one stood up. It was the kind of pause that didn't feel like part of the usual routine. The lights stayed dim. The seatbelt sign remained lit a little longer than normal. The flight crew didn't begin their usual cheerful chatter about baggage and connections. There were no warm goodbyes, no thanks for flying with us, only stillness, controlled, careful, too careful. Leona noticed the subtle things first. The way Daniel lingered at the front near the cockpit, glancing back toward the curtain with tight shoulders. The way one of the pilots stepped into the aisle, whispered something to the supervisor, then stepped back again, his expression unreadable. The way Tara hadn't appeared, not once, since the captain's final announcement. She had disappeared from the cabin entirely. Leona sat straight, hands clasped, eyes forward. She didn't fidget, didn't reach for her bag, didn't even look toward the other passengers who now sat awkwardly, shifting in their seats, clearly wondering what the holdup was. No one said her name. No one asked if she was okay. But everyone knew. They didn't know the details. They hadn't read the reports or seen the flagged compliance data scroll across an executive dashboard. But they had seen enough. A spilled drink, a tense exchange, a crew member gone quiet, a supervisor called mid-flight. It was more than enough for the average passenger to understand. Something had happened, and whatever it was serious. Leona glanced out the window. On the tarmac below, she could see them now. 3 figures standing just past the jet bridge, 2 in navy blue airport operations uniforms, 1 in a tailored charcoal suit, holding a thin folder under his arm. He wasn't fidgeting, he wasn't smiling. He was just waiting, the way people wait when they already know what's coming. Inside her chest, a familiar pressure tightened. Not fear, not regret, but that old persistent question, will they actually act this time, or will they smooth it over? She had seen it happen before, meetings where everyone nodded, then buried the complaint in paperwork, community panels where stories like hers were described as isolated incidents, apologies that sounded like favors, invitations to speak at diversity forums that changed nothing. She had learned to prepare for the letdown, even while pushing for justice. But something about this moment felt different. Not because of the people, but because of the process. This wasn't a whisper in the break room. This wasn't a side conversation. This was a documented protocol, triggered mid-flight, sent to 3 departments and 1 federal oversight office. Tier 1 meant accountability wasn't optional. It meant the silence that had protected people like Tara for years wouldn't be enough this time. The seatbelt sign finally blinked off with a sharp ding. Still, no one moved. Then came the announcement. A male voice this time, calm, measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, we kindly ask all passengers to remain seated for a brief moment. Some members of our cabin crew will be asked to exit first for immediate debriefing. Your patience is appreciated." Gasps didn't fill the cabin. There were no shouts, just silence and wide eyes. Leona slowly turned her head, glancing toward the rear of the aircraft. From the narrow gap near the lavatory, she saw her, Tara, standing stiffly, arms crossed in front of her apron, expression blank. Two people were speaking to her. One of them held an iPad. She couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. This was the moment Tara had never expected. The one where the person she'd quietly dismissed turned out not to be invisible. Leona looked away, not to spare her the shame, but because it wasn't her responsibility to witness it. She had done what she needed to do, with restraint, with precision, without raising her voice. Now the system had to do the rest. Moments later, the front door opened with a soft hiss. A gust of colder air entered the cabin, followed by quiet footsteps. A man in a dark suit walked in first. Early 50s, balding, wireframe glasses. His badge hung from a leather lanyard tucked beneath his blazer. He didn't speak right away. He simply looked down the aisle, scanning the passengers, then nodded to someone behind him. Daniel approached Leona's seat. He didn't kneel, didn't whisper. He just stood there, straight, composed, and said, "Ms. Briggs, the operations team would like to speak with you briefly before you exit. You're welcome to remain seated until they're ready, or step off first if you'd prefer." Leona looked up at him. His voice was calm, but his eyes, they weren't avoiding hers anymore. They held something else now. Accountability. She nodded once. "I'll wait." He inclined his head and stepped aside. Behind her she heard movement. A carry-on being pulled from the overhead. Not hers. A passenger was leaving early, probably hoping to escape the discomfort of being in the same cabin where it happened. That's what some people did. Fled the discomfort. Pretended neutrality. But Leona wasn't leaving early. She would walk off that plane last if she had to. Not out of pride, but because she needed to feel her steps. Needed to remember what it felt like to walk through a moment she didn't let pass quietly. The passengers ahead of her slowly began to stand, one by one. No rush, no chatter. Just stiff shoulders and eyes darting away from hers. She didn't look down, didn't shrink, didn't offer comfort to ease their awkwardness. She had carried too much for too long. Now it was their turn to sit with the weight. And as they filed out, she remained still, calm and grounded, watching the same door that had let her in now open for something else entirely. Not a new city, not a hotel, not a reunion, but accountability. Waiting, without apology. The line of passengers slowly moved past Leona's seat, each person stepping into the aisle with careful motions, as if afraid to draw attention to themselves. Eyes darted toward her, then quickly away again. Some nodded slightly. Some gave tight, nervous smiles. Most looked down. No one said her name. No one said anything at all. It was a familiar silence. Awkward, uncertain, but safe for them. The kind of silence people reach for when they don't know how to engage without being implicated. When they've witnessed something wrong but don't have the language or the courage to acknowledge it. So they choose the polite route. The quiet exit. The unspoken message. This wasn't my business. Leona didn't blame them. Not really. She had seen this kind of detachment 100 times before. At City Hall, in staff meetings, in public forums where someone told their story, earnest, wounded, and the room nodded and moved on. People weren't always cruel, but they were practiced at avoidance, especially when justice felt inconvenient. She sat still, watching the aisle clear one row at a time. The man from across the aisle, the one who'd laughed early in the flight when she was denied her water, avoided her gaze entirely as he passed. His face was red, his steps unusually quick. He clutched his briefcase tighter than necessary. A small gesture, but loud in its meaning. He remembered, and he knew. As the last few passengers collected their coats and stepped off, Mrs. Connolly hesitated beside Leona's seat. Her hands clutched the strap of her bag, knuckles white. She began, her voice hoarse. Leona looked up, meeting her eyes with a calm, unreadable expression. Mrs. Connolly shifted her weight, trying to find the right words. "You shouldn't have had to go through that," she whispered. "And I'm sorry I didn't say something earlier." Leona studied her for a moment. She could see the sincerity beneath the nervousness, the kind of regret that comes not from guilt, but from having looked away when it mattered. "Next time," Leona said softly, "don't wait." The woman's eyes filled with something, not tears, not shame, but quiet understanding. She nodded and moved down the aisle. Then Leona was alone, truly alone. The cabin was empty now, except for the supervisor, the male attendant Daniel, and the 2 ground officials waiting just outside the door. Tara had been escorted off already. Leona hadn't seen it, didn't need to. The outcome was already in motion. Still, she felt the weight in her chest. Not satisfaction, not relief. Something else, something heavier. This wasn't a victory parade, this was a reckoning. The kind that left no joy behind, only clarity. The kind that forced everyone, even those who thought they were neutral, to look in the mirror and ask themselves where they stood. Daniel approached again. "They're ready for you now, Ms. Briggs. No rush." Leona nodded and stood, brushing the creases from her coat. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She didn't rush. She didn't fumble for her belongings. She collected her tablet, her notebook, and her small handbag. Everything in its place, as if stepping into a meeting, not exiting a flight. As she walked forward, she noticed something odd, something she hadn't expected. Someone had placed a clean, folded cloth napkin on the tray table in front of her seat. It hadn't been there before. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. But she understood. A quiet apology. The kind that never leaves anyone's mouth, but appears when guilt finally outweighs pride. She walked past it. Each step toward the open cabin door felt like shedding a layer of silence that had wrapped itself around her since boarding. By the time she reached the exit, she no longer felt tired. She felt steady. The man in the dark suit greeted her first. His voice was low, measured. "Ms. Briggs, thank you for your cooperation. We'd like a few moments of your time in the lounge just past the jet bridge." He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't tell her they were sorry. He used her name. He stepped aside, and he led. That, in itself, was enough. As she stepped off the plane, a cool draft of air hit her skin. The terminal was mostly quiet. Late-night travelers, a few blinking monitors, airport staff cleaning the rows of seats near Gate 49. But the silence here felt different. This silence wasn't dismissal. It was preparation, because what had started in seat 2A wasn't going to end in that lounge. It was going somewhere much bigger. The corridor of the jet bridge was colder than expected. Not freezing, but just enough to lift goosebumps along Leona's arms beneath her coat sleeves. The air smelled faintly of engine fuel and synthetic carpet cleaner, a strange mix, but it grounded her, reminded her she was no longer in the suspended world of the aircraft. Her heels made soft, deliberate sounds on the metal walkway as she followed the operations supervisor through the narrow passage. Each step echoed faintly, rhythmically, as if time was finally catching up with everything she'd been holding back for the last few hours. No one rushed her. No one tried to talk casually. That in itself was a shift. She entered the private executive lounge through a frosted glass door. The lighting was low and warm, the furniture soft and modern, clearly designed for VIPs, not passengers filing off commercial flights. A tray of bottled water and coffee sat untouched in the corner. No one offered it to her. No one assumed. They waited. The man in the charcoal suit, now seated, gestured calmly toward the opposite chair. "Ms. Briggs, thank you for joining us. Please, make yourself comfortable." She didn't sit right away. Instead, she looked around, taking in every detail. Not because she was curious, because that's what she'd learned to do. Observe. Take mental snapshots. Record what others missed. She finally lowered herself into the leather seat, crossed her legs, set her bag beside her, the same way she would in a boardroom. The supervisor opened a slim laptop and cleared his throat gently. First, I want to formally acknowledge receipt of your in-flight conduct report. We've reviewed the preliminary documentation, including the Tier 1 escalation that was auto-triggered by the system linked to Chief Darren Briggs's oversight program. He said it without hesitation. No dancing around her husband's title, no awkward comments, just facts. Leona nodded once. Good. The man continued. Our initial review has already confirmed at least 3 discrepancies in service records. The meal logs don't match the manifest. Cabin footage shows inconsistencies in crew engagement. And we've retrieved the audio where Ms. Mendez told you, and I quote, "Didn't see you there." A beat passed, then 2. He didn't ask for a response, didn't try to soften it. Just let the words sit in the room. I see, Leona said quietly. We take this extremely seriously, Ms. Briggs. The crew member in question has been removed from service pending full investigation. A statement will be released by morning. She leaned forward slightly, her hands folded. Is it going to be one of those polished statements? The kind that talks about learning opportunities and isolated situations while avoiding the word discrimination entirely? His face twitched, just barely. A sign he wasn't used to being challenged directly, especially not in a tone this calm. I understand your concern, he replied. I assure you our legal and DEI teams will handle this carefully. Leona's jaw tightened at the acronym. You mean the same diversity teams that help clean up press messes instead of confronting the culture that causes them? He blinked. She didn't flinch. I don't need a gesture. I don't want a phone call from someone's assistant or a travel voucher for my trouble. Her voice stayed even, controlled. I want structural consequence, not performative response. There it was, what she had been holding in since the sandwich, the water, the soft smirk that followed it. This wasn't about rage, it was about reality, and she refused to let it be wrapped up in apology emails and scripted empathy. The man exhaled slowly, folding his hands. We're prepared to offer you a formal seat on our advisory review board, he said after a pause. Confidential, compensated, and independent from marketing. We're rebuilding our internal service bias training and we'd value your input. Leona looked at him for a long time. She wasn't surprised. This was how systems operated. They avoided blame by inviting the harmed into the solution, as if participation meant healing, as if consultation was the same as justice. She weighed her options. She could decline and walk away with her dignity untouched, or she could accept, but on her terms. Fine, she said, but I choose what meetings I attend. I choose what I say. And I choose whether or not my name appears in your press releases. Of course. And, she added more sharply, I want to be the one to draft the section on microaggressions in first-class service training, not your marketing team. That caught him off guard. She didn't wait for agreement. She stood slowly, gathering her things. The weight of the moment wasn't gone, but it had shifted. What began as quiet exclusion had now been documented, reviewed, and responded to. And not because someone had given her permission, but because she'd refused to ask for it. As she walked toward the exit, the supervisor stood, uncertain whether to extend a handshake. He didn't. Smart. Outside the frosted glass door, the terminal was nearly empty. The late hour had thinned the crowd to a few cleaning crews and a lone woman dragging a sleepy child behind her. Leona walked past them, her steps steady, her chin lifted. Not with pride, but with peace. She wasn't leaving victorious. She was leaving seen. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The sliding glass doors at the terminal exit parted with a soft mechanical sigh. A gentle wind brushed against Leona's face as she stepped into the crisp DC night. The parking lot was quiet, lit by rows of halogen lamps casting long shadows across empty lanes. Her heels clicked softly on the pavement as she walked toward the designated pickup zone. She wasn't in a hurry. She carried no anger now, no adrenaline, just a quiet fullness in her chest, heavy but not painful, like something that had long been locked away had finally been named, heard, and placed down. Not discarded, not forgotten, just no longer hers to carry alone. A black sedan pulled to a stop at the curb, the window lowered. Darren Briggs sat behind the wheel, dressed in a dark wool coat, his badge barely visible beneath the collar. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her with those steady eyes that had weathered 1,000 policy debates, protests, and backroom fights the public would never hear about. Leona opened the door and slid in beside him. The warmth of the car wrapped around her instantly, but she didn't lean back. Not yet. He glanced over. "You good?" She paused, then nodded. "I stayed quiet, then I made it count." He smiled. Not the kind you give for comfort, but the kind you give when you know the cost of what someone just endured. The kind that says, you did it right. You did it your way. They pulled out of the lot, the city skyline rising faintly in the distance. Headlights passed in waves as they merged onto the freeway. Leona watched the blur of signs and shadows through the window. Somewhere behind them, the airline's internal system was running overnight audits. Somewhere in a boardroom, executives would arrive in the morning to a flagged report with her name on it. And somewhere in a quiet corner of the internet, a draft statement was likely already being reviewed, rewritten, softened. But that didn't matter to her, because the real outcome wasn't in the headlines. It was in the silence she refused to fill, in the pause she had turned into action, in the moment she chose not to explain herself, not to perform gratitude, not to protect the comfort of those who hadn't protected her. She didn't need to go viral. She needed to be heard, and she had been. Darren reached over and gently took her hand. No words, just pressure, warmth, the quiet solidarity of someone who knew exactly what her silence had cost and what her voice had reclaimed. The car kept moving through the city lights. At a red light, she finally leaned back into the seat, exhaled, and closed her eyes for just a moment. Not to forget, but to rest. Because some endings aren't loud, they're just honest. And that's enough. If this story moved you, please give the video a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one coming soon.